Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you may be. Welcome to the fourth lecture organized by the Rammohun Roy Reappraisal at 250 Society. Today's lecture is on Rammohun Roy, the Modern Vedanti. We have our speakers, Professor Dermot Killingley from Newcastle University, and we have Professor Omyo Shen, who is an honorary fellow of the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. We will have Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee, Chancellor of Ashoka University, to chair this meeting. I'll request Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee to take care of the meeting from now on. Over to Professor Mukherjee.
Thank you, Amit, and welcome Dermot Killingley and Omyo Sen. I will just introduce Professor Killingley, and then after he has spoken, I'll introduce Omyo Sen, and then we can have kind of an interaction with the audience with whatever time is left. Dermot Killingley studied Sanskrit at Oxford, and then he went on to do a PhD from SOAS in the University of London. His doctoral dissertation was on Rammohun Roy's interpretation of the Vedanta. He has taught in the Department of Indian Studies in the University of Malaya, but most of his scholarly and teaching career has been spent in the University of Newcastle, in the Department of Religious Studies, and then as reader in Hindu Studies in the University of Newcastle. He was also a visiting professor at the University of Vienna. He has written extensively on ancient Indian thought and its modern interpretations. The best known of his book and the most relevant for this evening is his book on Rammohun Roy in Hindu and Christian tradition. He has a 3-volume introductory book called Beginning Sanskrit, which I think is important to mention here. It's over to you, Professor Killingley. I'm sorry that we don't have too many attendees, but I'm sure stragglers will be joining in as you start. Over to you.
Thank you, Professor Mukherjee. And thank you for inviting me to take part in the celebration of Rammohun, a man whom I admire and I've been trying to understand for many years. I regret that though I read Bengali, especially the rather limited and Sanskritic kind of Bengali that Rammohun wrote, I don't speak it. So please forgive me if I mispronounce Bengali words. I'm very glad to be able to take part online from my home in Newcastle upon Tyne in the northeast of England, saving me the need to travel to Kolkata. The increased use of online communication, including international communication and online meetings such as this, is one of the side effects of the COVID pandemic. We must be grateful for it, while not forgetting the pandemic's main effects, the suffering and death of millions of people. If it had come a few decades ago, before online communication became possible, it would have been much worse. International communication was important for Rammohun Roy, and he had correspondence in the British Isles, in France, and in the USA. In those countries, he became known to a wider public through reviews and reprints of his publications and reports by his admirers and by his critics. In his day, international communication was a matter of handwritten letters and printed books and tracts and periodicals, which took months to cross the sea. And in a few cases, communication involved travel, such as Rammohun's journey to England, which took over 4.5 months. When he arrived in England, he was met by people who already knew and admired him in Liverpool and London and Bristol. He made effective use of the means of communication available in his time, perhaps more than any of his Indian contemporaries. And this is part of what I mean when I call him modern. Besides international communication, Rammohun was active in communication between the various communities present in Kolkata, Hindu, Muslim, and Christian. He wrote Bengali, though he admitted in his first Bengali publication that few people had the habit of reading Bengali prose. He conducted a newspaper in Persian, and he wrote elegant English, both in his publications and in his letters. It was important for him that communication should not be within a particular ethnic group, not a particular religious tradition or sampradaya, or a particular circle or dal. And Calcutta at that time was full of dals led by influential men. Communication for Rammohun was not just a way of making his views known to others. It was necessary for forming enlightened views. In his first Bengali publication, he complains that those who reject his view of God are limited in their outlook. And I'm showing a quotation on the screen there. I hope you can see it. People think that his teaching is only taught by one or two people and is contrary to what all the people of the world believe. Rammohun answers, India is not 1/20th of the boundaries of the world which we have ascertained and travelled over up to the present time. Apart from India, in more than half the world, people worship one pure God. In India itself, the Nirvana sect, the Nanak sect, and the Dadu sect, the Shivanarayans, and others, both householders and ascetics, worship God without form alone. So how can they say that this doctrine of the worship of God is quite outside the belief of the world? If the people of this country would inquire and travel, they would never believe the story that this belief is different from the ideas of the world and all pundits. As you can understand from this passage, Rammohun insisted on the unity of God. God, he taught, is eternal, infinite, all-powerful, uncaused, unchangeable, and the cause of the world. God is different from anything that has name and form, or namarupa. Anything that has name and form is finite and limited in time and place, with limited power, and changeable. To identify God with any mythical or historical person, or with a physical image, or even a mental image, is to insult God by denying his infinite nature. In the passage I've just quoted, and in many places elsewhere, Rammohun insists that this doctrine of the unity of God is in accordance with the Vedanta. When Rammohun says Vedanta, he understands Advaita Vedanta, as taught by Shankara. One of the ways in which he upheld this doctrine was by publishing translations of the Upanishads. On the title pages, he said that the translation is according to the gloss of the celebrated Shankaracharya. The Sanskritist Horace Hayman Wilson, who knew him personally and interpreted and respected him as a scholar, described him as a diligent student of Shankara's works and philosophical teacher of his doctrine. That's in the preface to Wilson's Sanskrit Dictionary of 1819. And in 1823, Rammohun's group was referred to as the sect of Vedantis, who have rejected the popular polytheistic notions of the Hindus, a sect which is said to have been increasing rapidly in Bengal of late years. This appeared in the Calcutta Journal, which was founded and edited by Rammohun's supporter, James Silk Buckingham. we can count it as a friendly piece of public relations for Rammohun. But it was not only his supporters that published pieces about him and his associates. A less friendly periodical, the Calcutta Christian Observer, referred to Rammohun's group as the Vedantists in March 1833. That was after Rammohun had left Kolkata. So we're justified in calling Rammohun a Vedanti. Because of his way of understanding Vedanta and his international outlook, I suggest that we call him a modern Vedanti. Rammohun did not always write in terms of Vedanta. He used the language of Islamic theology in his Tuhfat al-Muwahhidin, published before he settled in Kolkata, and he used Christian theology with detailed biblical references in his controversies with Christian opponents. And in his writing on public matters, in Kolkata and later in London, he used the language of contemporary politics, including expressions of loyalty and gratitude for British rule, which we may find obsequious. Many of his Vedantic works were published in English as well as Bengali, so they addressed not only Hindus, but Europeans interested in Hinduism, whether Orientalists like H.H. Wilson or Christian opponents of Hinduism like the Baptist missionaries. So Vedanta was only one of the forms of discourse that he used, but when he used it, he followed its rules. He assumed that the whole Veda was authoritative. He took the Upanishads, the only part of the Veda that he knew, as a source of truth, to be interpreted in a way that is consistent with observation, pratyokta, and inference, Anuman. And he took Shankara as his authority in interpreting them. Rammohun's first publication after he settled in Kolkata in 1815 was a commentary on the Vedanta Sutras, or Brahma Sutras. I'll say more about it later, but in form, it presents the 4 chapters of the Sutras, each divided into 4 sections, containing over 550 sutras in all. The Vedanta Sutras, dating perhaps from the 3rd or 4th century CE, are the earliest attempts at a systematic presentation of the teachings of the Upanishads, and they form the foundation of the various schools of Vedanta. The sutras are very brief notes, so brief that they make little sense without a commentary. The oldest commentary is by Shankara, and it interprets them as upholding his Advaita Vedanta doctrine. Rammohun's commentary follows Shankara's in the main, but it's much briefer, and it departs from his interpretation at significant points. He doesn't say on the title page that he's following Shankara, though he does say that in his Upanishad translations, but in fact, he follows Shankara in most of the sutras. He doesn't follow any other commentator. But there are about 56 sutras where Rammohun departs from Shankara, and these are the places where Shankara's interpretation doesn't fit Rammohun's modern outlook. Rammohun's publication of the Vedanta Sutras, like most of his Bengali works, does not carry his name. I've shown the text of the title page. There's an English title page, although the book is in Bengali. And the title page calls it the Bengali translation of the Vedanta, or Resolution of all the Vedas, the most celebrated work of Brahmanical theology, establishing the unity of the Supreme Being and that he is the only object of worship, together with a preface by the translator. This title page, although it's anonymous, is Rammohun's first public declaration of his modern view of Vedanta. By using English, it shows that Rammohun's campaign is not just for Indian readers. but he has an eye on the English-reading public and eventually on the international readership which he reached later in his English works. By referring to God as the supreme being, it uses the language of contemporary European rational theism. Rammohun often refers to God as the supreme being or the supreme spirit or the author and governor of the universe in his English works. In Bengali, he uses Atma or Brahma or Parabrahma or Ishwar. By mentioning the unity of the supreme being and that he is the only object of worship, Rammohun is launching an attack on polytheism, on the worship of what he elsewhere calls figured gods, in Bengali, gods that have nama-rupa. Not only idols, but mental images and mythological figures. Rammohun argues that God is infinite, uncaused, and imperishable, while any image or any person, or even anything formed in someone's mind, is limited in space and time and results from specific causes and will perish. Therefore, idolatry, not only idolatry, but any identification of God with a person, whether a person spoken of in mythology such as Shiva or Vishnu, or a historical person such as Jesus, is an insult to God. The Bengali preface to the Vedanta Sutra commentary is actually two prefaces, headed Bhumika and Anushthan, elaborates these themes. The Vedanta, Rammohun says, is little known in Bengal, and this is why so many are misled by self-interested pundits and worship imagined objects, beasts, birds, clay, or stone. God is unknown in his Swarupa, but is known through reason as the maker and regulator of the world. Against those who insist that worship of gods is sanctioned by tradition, and that Rammohun's theism is only the opinion of a few, he argues that outside India, more than half the world worships one God, and even in India, some do so, such as followers of Nanak and Dadu, as I've quoted already. I'll say more about Rammohun's Vedanta Sutra commentary later, but now I want to introduce his other Vedantic works. He followed it with the Vedanta Sara, which is an abridgment of the Vedanta Grant in Bengali, a shorter presentation giving a selection of the sutras in a new order, which makes the argument clearer. And then he translated that into English as translation of an abridgment of the Vedanta in 1816. He then translated 4 of the Upanishads into Bengali and into English, the Kena, Isha, Kata, and Mundaka Upanishads. Each of the English translations claims in the title page that it's according to the gloss of Shankaracharya, though, as with the Vedanta Sutras, they're also influenced by Rammohun's own ideas of rational theism. Shankara commented on 10 of the Upanishads, but there are several reasons why Rammohun chose these 4. First, they're relatively short, especially the Isha, which is very short. Secondly, they're less concerned with Vedic ritual than some of the others. And thirdly, they contain fairly clear statements of the unity of Brahman and the idea that the author of the universe is a person. He also translated the 5th Upanishad, the Mandukya, but only into Bengali. He may have judged that its impersonal view of Brahman and its view of the world as an illusion make it unsuitable for European readers. In the Bengali version, he tries to mitigate these features, but not very successfully. Why did Rammohun choose Vedanta to carry his message of the worship of one formless God? Advaita Vedanta was not much studied in Bengal, and part of the task which Rammohun set himself was to give it more prominence. He presents it as a means of opposing what he objects to in current Hinduism: polytheism, idolatry, that is, the representation of God in images and narratives, and concern with ritual purity. In a letter to his former employer, the civil servant John Digby, in 1817, he says that he has translated the Vedanta, meaning the Vedanta Sutras, into Bengali for the benefit of Hindus in order to convince them that the unity of God and the absurdities of idolatry are evidently pointed out by their own scriptures. Other traditions were more current in Bengal than Advaita Vedanta. Navyanyaya had a strong representation in Nadia, and the Chaitanya tradition of Vaishnavism, to which Rammohun's family belonged, had developed its own form of Vedanta, Achintya Veda. There was also a strong tantric tradition in Bengal. If we can suppose for a moment that Rammohun had not taken the Advaita line that he did, would he have chosen one of those? Take Nyaya, a system of logic designed to ensure that inference from sense data are valid. Since Rammohun often referred to reason when writing in English, Jukti is the word he uses in Bengali, to support his view of the existence of God and the need to worship him, would he not have urged his countrymen to follow the Nyaya school as a way of ensuring valid reasoning? In fact, he only refers to Nyaya in two places. One is in the collection of tracts called the Brahmanical Magazine, or the Missionary and the Brahmin. Though it's called the Brahmanical Magazine, it's not a periodical. It's a series of 4 tracts appearing at irregular intervals. The first tract is part of a reply to a critique of Hindu doctrine, which appeared in Bengali in the Samachar Dopan, the Bengali periodical published by the Baptist missionaries of Srirampur. The missionary writer accuses Nyaya of making God dependent on matter for the creation of the world, and making the jiva, the soul, like God, only less powerful. Rammohun replies that the Nyaya view of God is similar to the Christian one, and that any objection to the Nyaya doctrine must apply to Christianity also. He only mentions Nyaya here because it has been attacked by the Christian writer. Rammohun's defense of Advaita Vedanta, which the Christian writer also attacks, is much longer. We should remember too that the Brahmanical Magazine was published not in Rammohun's name, but in that of a pundit who worked for him, Shiva Prasad Sharma. It was a common practice of Rammohun to issue publications either anonymously or in the names of his associates, so that they didn't appear to represent the views of one person only. We can accept the Brahmanical Magazine as a work of Rammohun, not only because it was commonly recognized as such by his contemporaries, but because the Bengali original is in his style, and because in the 4th and last tract, which appeared only in English, it shows a knowledge of Christian theology, in particular the views of particular British theologians on the Trinity, which would be unlikely in a pundit, but not unexpected in Rammohun, who is familiar with European thought, and especially with Unitarian arguments against the doctrine of the Trinity. The only other place where Rammohun makes any mention of Nyaya is in his letter to the Governor-General Lord Amherst in 1823, this time writing in his own name. The letter is prompted by a government proposal to establish a Sanskrit college in Kolkata. Rammohun argues passionately against this proposal, as there are many places of Sanskrit learning already. He welcomes the laudable desire of government to improve the natives of India by education, and improvement is a common theme of this letter. He mentions the word improve, and improvement comes in many times. He says the way to achieve this improvement is by employing European gentlemen of talent and education to instruct the natives of India in mathematics, natural philosophy, chemistry, anatomy, and other useful sciences, which the natives of Europe have carried to a degree of perfection that has raised them above the inhabitants of other parts of the world. The proposed Sanskrit college, instead of forwarding the aim of improvement, will, Rammohun says, completely defeat the object proposed. Part of his argument is that it takes 12 years to learn Sanskrit. That's a traditional estimate, though fortunately it can be done much quicker. But he further argues that the Sanskrit system of education would be the best calculated to keep this country in darkness. As an example, he says, the student of Nyaya Shastra cannot be said to have improved his mind after he's learnt from it how many ideal classes the objects of the universe are divided, and what speculative relation the soul bears to the body to the soul, the eye to the ear, etc. That's all he says about Nyaya in the letter. There's no suggestion that it would help the student to think logically. As I said earlier, he doesn't mention Nyaya anywhere else in his works, except in this letter in education and in the reply to the Baptist missionary. The letter on education makes similar disparaging remarks about Sanskrit grammatical theory, Vyakaran, and Mimamsa. The Bengali Vaishnava tradition, inherited from Chaitanya in the 16th century, teaches that God created the world and that he is to be worshipped in the form of Krishna. Rammohun, like many Bengalis, came from a Vaishnava family. There are stories of his early Vaishnava piety, but these, of course, are unverifiable. What is certain is that his publications when he lived in Kolkata from 1815 to 1830 show a clear antipathy to Vaishnavism. Not that he singled out Vaishnavism as the sole target of his attacks. He opposed all forms of worship that identified God with an image or the mythological figure or a person. But it's true that many of Rammohun's attacks on the worship of figured gods, as he called them, that is, representation of God in iconography or mythology, refer to the worship of Krishna. At least two of his Hindu opponents were Vaishnavas and attacked him from explicitly Vaishnava positions. Uttavananda Bhattacharya in 1816 and an unnamed Goswami in 1818. Rammohun often points to stories of Krishna as examples of the immorality of Hindu mythology. He says, talking about Krishna, he mentions his perpetration of murder upon a female of the name of Putana, and his compelling a great number of married and unmarried women to stand before him denuded. This is when he steals the clothes of the gopis. But he also points to stories of Shiva, such as his criminal attachment to Mohini, disregarding all ideas of decency, and his helping Ashwatthama to massacre the sleeping army of the Pandavas in the 10th book of the Mahabharata. The Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition is hostile to Advaita Vedanta as a direct contradiction of its view of the personal nature of God and the reality of God's form. Shaktas, on the other hand, are able to accommodate Advaita Vedanta and to use its arguments in their own texts. While Rammohun rejected the Vaishnavism in which he was brought up, he was much more receptive to Tantrism. Since Vaishnavism and Tantrism were the two prevailing religious traditions of Bengal, several Bengali scholars have described him as biased against Vaishnavism and in favor of Tantrism. I think that's a misleading opposition because his attacks on Vaishnavism are not against Vaishnavism as such, but against the identification of God with a being that has name and form, in this case Krishna, as represented in the Bhagavata Purana. But the same objection applies to an image of Shiva or Kali, or to Jesus, as represented in Anglican worship. The position from which he opposes such representations is that of reason, and in his view, among Hindu traditions, Advaita Vedanta is the one that represents reason. Tantrism has many forms, including Buddhist and Vaishnava forms, but in Bengal is closely identified with the cult of the goddess, Shaktism. Shaktivism and Vaishnavism are the main Hindu traditions of Bengal, and in Rammohun's time, Shaktism seems to have been the one that prevailed among the elite. Vaishnavism belonged to the rural eastern parts of Bengal. Rammohun knew the tantric sannyasi Hariharanandana Tirtha Swami. In 1799, Hariharanandanath witnessed a legal document for him. Later, in 1819, Hariharanandanath signed a letter against Sati, published in the India Gazette. And then reprinted in the Calcutta Journal. The letter doesn't mention Rammohun, but it mentions the first of his tracts against Sati, and it can be considered a piece of support for his campaign. It says that this tract against Sati, which as usual was anonymous, was issued by Vaikuntanath Banerjee, secretary to the Brahma or Unitarian Hindu community. This is interesting as the first indication that Rammohun's religious group, which was usually called the Amiya Shabha, was already known by the name Brahma, which was later incorporated into the names Brahma Samaj and Brahma Sabha. The words Brahma, Brahmya or Brahma in Sanskrit, two synonymous Sanskrit words or two spellings of the same Bengali word, usually translated theistic. It's also interesting to see that Rammohun's group was being identified as Unitarian. Although Rammohun condemns tantric practices as abominations, he quotes tantric texts frequently in support of his views. Indeed, he quotes tantras more frequently than Puranas. In one of his works, he states the Purana and Tantra are, of course, to be considered as Shastra, for they repeatedly declare God to be one and above the apprehension of the external and internal senses. This throws light on Rammohun's view of textual authority. A text is to be considered as authoritative, as Shastra, if it teaches the worship of one true God. He recognizes that Puranas and Tantras include much mythological material and instructions on the worship of images. As he says, they indeed expressly declare the divinity of many gods and goddesses and the modes of their worship. But, he says, they reconcile those contradictory assertions by affirming frequently that the directions to worship any figured beings are only applicable to those who are incapable of elevating their minds to the idea of an invisible supreme being, in order that such persons, by fixing their attention on those invented figures, may be able to restrain themselves from vicious temptations, and that those who are competent for the worship of the invisible God should disregard the worship of idols. Rammohun thus uses the notion of adhikara, entitlement of different people to perform different rituals. And in the Bengali original of this passage, he uses the word adhikara. The letter on education, which I quoted earlier, makes disparaging remarks about Nyaya and Mimamsa, as I said before. What I didn't mention is that it also disparages Vedanta. Sorry. I'm trying to, yes, the passage I'm thinking of is where it says, neither can much improvement arise from such speculations as the following, which are the themes suggested by the Vedanta. In what manner is the soul absorbed in the deity? What relation does it bear to the divine essence? Nor will youths be fitted to be better members of society by the Vedantic doctrines which teach them to believe that all visible things have no real existence, that as father, brother, etc. have no real entity, they consequently deserve no real affection, and therefore the sooner we escape from them and leave the world, the better. This looks as if Rammohun has accepted the kind of criticism expressed in the missionary letter which prompted the first tract of the Brahmanical magazine. If there is one Atman, the idea that the soul receives good or bad experiences according to its actions is inexplicable. He says in the Bengali version of the Brahmanical magazine. That missionary letter also attacks the doctrine of Maya, whereby the visible world is only an appearance. The Vedanta which Rammohun rejects as a subject calculated to bring improvement is clearly Advaita, not any other Vedanta. Advaita is the one that the missionaries criticized for denying the existence of visible things and of human relationships. But it's interesting to see how Rammohun, writing as Shiva Prasad Sharma in the Brahmanical magazine, defends Vedanta against the missionary criticism. Maya, he says, is the creative power of God, the creative power of the eternal God. He also says that the world, as the Vedanta says, is the effect of Maya and is material, but God is mere spirit. Here he's talking in terms of the dualism of spirit and matter that was commonplace in Western thought in his time, using Chit or Chaitanya to stand for spirit or spiritual, and Jada for matter or material. To underline this opposition, Rammohun adds an introductory sentence in the English version, saying all the objects are divided into matter and spirit. That doesn't appear in the Bengali version. In defending Vedanta, he is reshaping it into a new form, in which the fundamental opposition is between spirit and matter, rather than between vidya and avidya, knowledge and wrong knowledge. When Rammohun attacks Vedanta in his letter on education, it's on the grounds that it will not lead to improvement. Yet in his other writings, he takes his stand on Vedanta and is even reported to have founded a Vedanta college, which also taught science. But that college was to teach the right kind of Vedanta favored by Rammohun. The proposed government-funded college in the hands of traditional pundits would teach the wrong kind of Vedanta. The typical or ideal Vedanti is the sannyasi, a man who has abandoned desires for sons or desire for wealth. Rammohun's lifestyle was very different. He did not detach himself from worldly concerns. He was very good at making money. He raised 2 sons. He was successful in business. He owned several grand houses, and he involved himself in public affairs through his journalistic and political and legal writings. Most obviously, he dressed elaborately in the Mughal style. His opponents objected to his tailored clothes, shilpi bostra, and other luxuries. His ideal was the godly householder, Brahmanishta Grihastha, the man concerned not only with knowing and worshipping God, but also with worldly matters. By the way, he assumes that the Brahmanishta Grihastha is a man, which may strike us as old-fashioned. He was modern in relation to his own time, not to ours. He was concerned with women, and his tracts against sati included an impassioned outcry against the mistreatment of Hindu women and a defense of their character, but he assumed that leadership belonged to men. Rammohun expressly rejects the idea that worship of God without the use of images or mythology is only for sannyasis, and that householders, he says Grihostra in Bengali, and laymen in English, are to worship gods and goddesses. In the passage I quoted earlier from the preface to Isha Upanishads, he refers to Vedanta Sutra 3.4.48, chapter 3, section 4, verse Sutra 48. He doesn't give the text of the sutra, as he sometimes does. He just says that it shows that this is the sutra here. He says it shows that a householder also is required to perform the worship of the Supreme Being. If we look at the sutra in Rammohun's commentary of 1815, we find that it's one of those which he interprets in an original way, completely different from Shankar's. The sutra simply means, but it's because of completeness that it concludes with the householder. Like many sutras, this makes no sense by itself. But Shankara explains it as resolving an apparent contradiction in Vedic teaching. Apparent contradictions in the Veda are important to Shankara because he's committed to the idea of ekabhaktita, the idea that the Veda is a single statement in which everything holds together, and all contradictions are only apparent. By resolving these apparent contradictions, he gets to a more precise understanding of what the whole Veda means. The apparent contradiction in this case is that the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, chapter 3, section 5, talks about giving up the desire for sons and living as a beggar, Vrikshachara, that is, as a sannyasi. A Brahmin should reach a state beyond ignorance and learning, beyond even silence and its opposite. Anything else, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad says, is afflicted. All this, as Shankara sees it, helps to establish the sannyasi as the only one who can reach freedom from affliction, to reach salvation, mukti, moksha. Why then, Shankara asks in his introduction to this sutra, does the Chandogya Upanishad end with a passage in praise of the householder? The last paragraph of the Chandogya Upanishad describes a man who studies the Veda in his teacher's house, returns to his own house, recites the Veda privately, rears virtuous children, controls his faculties, and practices non-violence except in certain circumstances. Someone who lives like this all his life reaches the world of Brahman and does not return, the Chandogya says. That is, he's not reborn, he's reached salvation. In Shankara's view, only a sannyasi can have perfect knowledge and so reach salvation. That is what Brihadaranyaka chapter 3, section 5 means. Why then does the Chandogya Upanishad end with the passage in praise of the householder, the opposite of the sannyasi? Shankara's answer is that it's because of the completeness of the householder's lifestyle. Besides the duties such as non-violence and control of the faculties, which fall to all four stages of life, the householder has to fulfill the duties of his own stage of life, such as sacrifices, which are very demanding. Whether or not you find Shankara's argument here convincing, what matters to us now is that Rammohun completely ignores Shankara and gives his own interpretation. He does not mention the last paragraph of the Chandogya Upanishad, which is the basis of Shankara's comment. This is my translation of Rammohun's Bengali.
If you're sharing, sir, we cannot see anything.
Sorry, you can't see the text, can you?
Right.
Can you not? No? Then maybe we should give up that up. But Rammohun summarizes the statement, according to the Veda, the householder has a family to study and will not return. But he says that does not apply to all householders. The completeness Krishna Baba mentioned in the sutra refers to the householder's complete set of duties, which includes seeing, hearing, thinking, and meditating on God. Rammohun follows the same interpretation in his preface to the Isha Upanishad. This is what he says in Bengali. He says, if you say that worship of God, God is Atma in Bengali and the Supreme Being in English, that I'm translating the Bengali here. If you say that worship of Atma is enjoined in Shastra, and worship of Devatas is also approved by Shastra, but worship of God is the duty of sannyasis, while worship of Devatas is the duty of householders, the answer is no such supposition is ever possible, because the Veda, the Vedanta, and Manu, and other Smriti texts show many times that worship of God is a duty of the householder. I have written a little about it. Authority for it in the Veda and Vedanta will be found in Vedanta Sutra, chapter 3, section 4, Sutra 48, which is the sutra I've just discussed. Shankara restricts knowledge of the Atman or Brahman and consequent salvation to sannyasis. Rammohun rejects this restriction, even while proclaiming himself a follower of Shankara. Rammohun's ideas of how God can be known and how God can be worshipped are also distinctive. God is known through our observation of the world, from which we can infer that it has a benevolent maker. In one of his later works, he wrote, "There is a God, as the indescribable creation and government of the universe clearly demonstrate." This view is contrary to that of Shankara, who held that Brahman could be known only from the Veda. Shankara rejects the Nyaya view that the existence of God could be known by inference from the world. In the same work, Religious Instructions Founded on Sacred Authorities, Rammohun says that this belief in God as the author and governor of the universe is shared all over the world. This implies that it is not known only from the Veda. Indeed, if our knowledge of God results from our observation of the world, it's not surprising that Rammohun should advocate science, the pursuit of better understanding of how the world is constructed, rather than traditional Vedanta. The worship of God, he says, includes action not only to prevent our own or others' ill, but to secure our own and others' good. And this too can be promoted by science. The kind of Vedanta which Rammohun opposed in his letter on education depended on transmission of knowledge from teacher to pupil, which is by nature exclusive. In Rammohun's time, knowledge was transmitted not only in that traditional way, but through printing and transport. Ideas such as rational theism and movements such as liberalism and Unitarianism flourished in seaports such as London, Bristol, Liverpool, Boston, and Kolkata, all towns in which Rammohun had his correspondence. Places where you find the sort of people who inquire and travel. In Rammohun's time, these were the places in which old traditions such as Vedanta could be understood in a modern way. Print and transport are still important in our own time, but we're less dependent on them. We're glad to be able to exchange ideas across the world without moving from in front of our computers. And so I'm grateful to the Rammohun Roy Reappraisal 250 Society, to Amit Das, to Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee, and to Professor Omir Sen, and to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Killingley. May I now invite Professor Omir P. Sen, who is the discussant for this evening. Professor Sen is a very, very distinguished historian of the intellectual and cultural history of colonial Bengal. He's the author of 15 books, and I can personally say that his books on Rammohun Roy, Ramakrishna Paramahansa, and the most recent one, Vidyasagar, I have learned an enormous amount from these books. He's also had a very, very distinguished career, academic career, which started at St. Stephen's College, but he was also the Agatha Harrison Fellow at St. Antony's in the University of Oxford. He held the Henrik Zimmer Chair in the University of Heidelberg, and he has been associated with the Universities of Delhi, Vishwabharati, and Jamia Millia Islamia. Amiya Babu, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Mukherjee, for those very kind words. And thank you also, Professor Killingley, for giving me this opportunity to interact with you. I say this because you are the authority on Rammohun, not I. I'm just a plain, ordinary historian of ideas. And I shall be speaking today primarily as a historian of ideas, not a scholar of religious studies, which you are. I'll confine myself, although you draw the bigger picture on Rammohun, I confine myself to observations on Rammohun as a Vedantin, which is really your topic. And I've organized these comments or observations in short points, which I think would be somewhat more intelligible as I speak to them. And they've been organized into 3 segments. First, I call the first segment as complicating factors in assessing Rammohun as a Vedantin. Secondly, argumentative problems in assessing Rammohun as a Vedantin. And thirdly, Rammohun's standing as a Vedantin, his uniqueness and his status and standing as a thinker in the tradition of Vedanta. Let me first, therefore, begin with the first segment, which is complicating factors. Now, I'd like to begin by drawing a distinction between Rammohun's modernizing Vedanta and drawing upon such elements of modernity within Vedanta which are amenable to modern thought and lifestyles. I think there is a subtle but important distinction. I personally don't think Vedanta can be modernized, right? And I say this because of reasons that I shall presently present before you. I personally think that he did the latter. That is, he very purposefully and strategically chose elements within Vedanta which were amenable to modern life, rather than modernize Vedanta. And therefore, it would be logical for me to say from that position that Ramon foisted upon Vedanta certain ideas and conclusions which he drew from outside the Vedanta. This is how I understand Ramon as a Vedanta. I say this for 3 reasons, basically, and this is my first point. First of all, Vedanta in pre-modern India was never static. It was a dynamic thought process. And, any number of scholars and theoreticians were working and thinking about this problem. On the other hand, modernity was never a value which Vedanta addressed. And they were not, at all alive to the problem of modernity. They were in their own theoretical and hermeneutic cocoons, as it were, and confined to that framework. They didn't think of modernizing Vedanta. If modernizing means updating, upgrading, improvising, innovations, and so on. That brings me to my second point within the same question. If modernization implies a degree of innovation, improvisation, etc., it is significant that Ramon consistently denied this position. The word that he uses is adhunik, which in Bangla means modern. He completely flatly denies that he was ever an adhunik, which is interesting. In his writings, he always consistently takes the position that it is he who projects the authenticity of the Vedantic tradition. His opponents, on the other hand, are either corrupting the Vedanta or misconstruing it. So this is a very orthodox line that Ramon adopts in relation to the Vedanta and the way he presents it. To me, this amounts to saying, and this is something very interesting that struck me very recently, it amounts to saying that there is really nothing new in what we think. Nothing comes out of nothing. There has to be a basis for what you're saying into something which is older. And I think I want to think harder on this question. I think this is the basis behind the use of the term Sanatan in the Hindu tradition, as it were. But as I say, this is very speculative at this stage. It's something that I need to work on further. The complicating factor here, as to my mind, is that Rammohun could not have been unaware of the changes that he was making, his deviations and his departures from the line of Shankara. And yet, he situates himself within the spiritual lineage of Shankara. Why is that? This is a question which no one is really seriously addressed, and it needs to be addressed. What is it that makes him do so? I'll come back to this question a little later when I take up Rammohun as a Shankarite Vedanti. Third, within the same framework, a few things which Rammohun says by way of his discourse don't sound to me at all to be modern. For example, his persistence on the world being transitory and an illusion. There he never departs from Shankara. In particular, if you look at his Brahma Sangit, his songs, they speak nothing but Boiragya and renunciation, which is a far cry from the very engaging world of affirmative kind of approach that he uses in his textual discourse. So there are two Rammohun speaking here, if you really looked at his Brahma Sangit and his textual discourse. In his Vedantic writings, he also departs, to my mind, very radically from the position of Trufat. In the way that in his commentary on the Upanishads, Kena and Katha, if I'm not mistaken, he complains about sulfate of reason. He says, we've been talking about an excessive reliance on reason. Reason doesn't get us to Brahman. It is Shabda, the word. So reason has its limits. To use his own words, reason creates universal doubts. These are his exact words in one of the commentaries on the, I think it is the Kena Upanishad, if I'm not mistaken. So the rationality in Rammohun doesn't desert him, I would say, but is mitigated, I think, by other factors which, as a Vedantin, he is bound to address. And, ultimately he is in a position which argues that rationality is important, but it can't ultimately procure everything for us. Rationality has to be combined with revelation. I don't think Ramon ever denies revelation in the ultimate analysis. The interesting part here is that even if Ramon sounds quite orthodox in his approach to Vedanta, he is actually not very orthodox. And why do I say that? I give you three reasons. First of all, he was not the typical exegete. He doesn't follow the typically accepted exegetical method of working on tradition. If you are a Vedantin and if you're writing a commentary, you have to compulsorily write simultaneously on three corpus of texts. One, the Upanishads, at least the major Upanishads, which Shankara did, 10 of them, I believe, the Brahma Sutra, and the Bhagavad Gita. Now, interestingly, Rammohun, I don't know if he wrote it, there's a humor to this, that he did write this. We never found a commentary on the Bhagavad Gita by Rammohun. But without a commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, you do not become entitled to be a Vedantin, technically speaking. That is mandatory for any Vedantin commenting on the Vedanta. Second, even in respect of Upanishads, as I was trying to hint here, Ramon is very selective about the Upanishads he chooses to comment on. Shankara commented on 10. Ramon chooses to comment only on 5. Again, why? This has to be explained. I think Professor Killingley did attempt explaining this, and I entirely agree with his argument that the exclusion of Chandogya and Brihadaranyaka are simply because of their size. They are enormous in their length. So I can understand that. But there is a double selectivity here. First, Rammohun chooses only Shankara, and secondly, he chooses only certain Upanishads that Shankara has commented on. This needs to be explained. This is speculative again, but I think in Rammohun's repertoire, the major Upanishad that mattered ultimately, and not just for him, but the entire history of the Brahma Samaj, is the Isha Upanishad. I say this because of two other incidents which struck me as a historian of ideas. It is the Isha Upanishad which transformed Devendranath, the Maharshi, into a bhakta, into a real spiritual figure. There is this legend about a torn leaf of the Isha Upanishad floating around and coming to the Maharshi, and the Maharshi then asking Ramchandra Vidyabhagish to decipher what that means for him, and that transformed his life. The other interesting anecdote about the Isha Upanishad in Indian thought is with Gandhi. Gandhi at Quilon says that if all of Hinduism was lost, but the Isha Upanishad survived, it would encapsulate the entire corpus of Hindu. So there is an interesting continuity that the Isha Upanishad enjoys, just as Advaita Vedanta enjoys since the days of Rammohun down to Radhakrishnan as the quintessential Vedanta thought, quintessential Indian thought, if you ask me. Whether that's right or wrong is a different question. Third, if you look carefully, again, I'm not competent to comment on this, and Professor Killingley would kindly correct me here if I'm wrong. Rammohun tends to follow not the Brahma Sutra directly while commenting. He relies much more on Sutra Bhashya by Shankara himself. So what is he exactly doing? Is he preparing a sub-commentary or is he preparing a comment? I would hazard the guess that Rammohun's work is actually an Anubhashya, a sub-commentary on Shankara, not an original commentary. If he were a proper Vedanti, he would have turned every now and then for every sutra to the Brahma Sutra directly. He doesn't do that, to the best of my knowledge. These facts lead me to the following conclusions. Number one, that Ramon was hermeneutically predisposed in favor of Shankara. That's very clear to me. The only scholar who thought, and I think he is not quite in the right, who thought that Ramon knew something about Ramanuja is Brojendranath Shila. He says that somewhere Ramon knew a little about Ramanuja. Well, I can still understand that. But what he does with Madhava, the other major Vedantin who is a dualist, is horrible. He compares Madhava with Charvak, which is astonishing, if you ask me. That's rather unkind. And I think it's devastating for any Vedantin to say that of another Vedantin. And he may disagree with dualism of the Madhava tradition, but he has no right to call him a Charvak for that matter, right? Ramon was not always even-handed with his opponents. I'll give you a very good example. In his Goswami Shohid Vichar, he reminds the Goswami that, look, Keshav Bharati, Chaitanya's guru, and Sridhar Swami, the famous commentator on the Bhagavad Puran, were both followers of Shankara. He's right. But the same argument can be done from the opposite direction. I would say that there are Dashnami sannyasis, very eminent ones, like Madhusudan Saraswati and Madhavendra Puri, who started as Vedantins and ended up as Krishna Bhaktas. Isn't that right? Madhusudan Saraswati is much closer to Rammohun, in fact, and there's no way in that Rammohun would not have heard about it. But Madhusudan Saraswati is a Krishna Bhakti in Vrindavan. He's also a Vedanti. So I think Rammohun ignores the dynamic here between dualism of Krishna Bhakti and the Advaitic tradition of the earlier Shankarite tradition. The question that I therefore pose myself is, why did Shankara choose to situate himself within the Shankarite? Ramon chose to suit himself in the Shankarite tradition. There could be two options here. One, Perhaps, and this is not something which you can wish away, I think there was already, even in Rammohun's time, the weight of tradition behind Shankara. Shankara was an enormously respected figure as a thinker, as a theoretician. There was no way in which you could have bypassed him. Please remember that all post-Shankara commentaries are actually rebuttals of Shankara himself. He is the reference point. Without addressing Shankara, you could not have either deviated from him or agreed with him. So that is quite possible. But the other option that I'm weighing seriously here is whether it was also a very expedient kind of a conclusion that he drew. Please remember here that by falling upon Shankara, he kills three birds with the same stone. Number one, he voices his dissent against idolatry. He voices his dissent against Hindu polytheism, and he voices his dissent against what he would call sectarian doctrinal orthodoxy, or the Vaishnavas, for example. I'll come to that a little later. So by choosing to work on the Shankara tradition, he serves the purpose of meeting all these three objections in the same package, as it were. Shankara is therefore a very attractive package for Rammohun. What are the arguments? This is my second section. What are the argumentative problems with Rammohun's Vedanta? First, as Professor Killingley rightly pointed out, Rammohun is willing to agree that only the existence of Brahman can be proven. That is the Tatastha Lakshana. And how can you prove it? By looking at his creation. So he's trying to say that if there is an effect, there must be a cause. So if the world is an effect, a creation of something, there must be a creator behind it. Incidentally, this is not a Vedantic argument, it's a Nyaya argument. Right? And Shankara completely rejects it. You cannot understand the world by merely observing it. You have to go by a faith in revelation, in Shabda, if I may come back to that point again. Interestingly, and as a historian of ideas cannot but mention this, this same problem comes back in the 1880s between two very contemporary and interesting figures, Bankim and Ramakrishna. Bankim meets Ramakrishna and has a dialogue. And after a while, Ramakrishna tells him, if you're in a mango orchard, focus on eating the mangoes. Why count the trees? So Bankim's position here is the Nyaya position. You understand the world by observing the world, observing its dynamics. Ramakrishna, on the other hand, is completely the Vedantin here, saying that you must take certain things for granted. You cannot understand reality by observing it. It's beyond reality, beyond observation. My second point here, if I agree with Rammohun's argument that Brahman is unknown, the Swarupa of Brahman cannot be known. Even if I concede that, the question still arises. Is the Brahman unknowable? Ramon doesn't answer that question. He may be unknown in the present state of knowledge, but is he unknowable too? I raise this question because this is exactly the question that Brijendranath Thakur raises. I mean, you may be an agnostic and say that, I don't know reality, but is the reality never knowable? That's the point that he raises. And Ramon could not have answered this question because he never acknowledged the domain of mysticism. Mysticism was out of the equation as far as he was concerned. But if you have any idea of what Ramakrishna's take here is on this question, Ramakrishna hints that he has had God experience. After all, he tells Vivekananda he's seen God just as he was seeing Vivekananda. Now, there's no reason to distrust him here. The point is that Ramakrishna believed that God realization was possible at some level, at the level of Samadhi, for instance, which Rammohun would have never conceded. So, in a gist, what Ramakrishna is saying, that God may be known, but his Swarupa cannot be expressed in human language. Ramakrishna told Vidyashavan, and I remember his famous words, Brahman Uchishtahanna. You cannot describe Brahman, what he is or what he is not, in human language. But he can be cognized at a certain level. That's what he's saying. You cannot ritually pollute Brahman because you can't utter what he is. And if you don't utter, then you don't ritually pollute the very nature of Brahman, which I think was a fantastic way of expressing what he wanted to express. I also, as a person interested in the history of Brahmanism, I am really bound to say that Rammohun's concept of Nirakar and Nirguna Brahman posed a real problem for Brahmos in later time. I can understand the Nirakar part. Nirakar was a part of Hinduism too at one level. So was Nirguna. But the problem is, if you wish to relate to God, you have to ascribe certain qualities to him. How can you relate to a Nirguna God who has no properties, no attributes? I mean, Rammohun, if I heard Professor Killingley say, Rammohun assumed that God was benevolent, right? If he is a benevolent God, can you ascribe even the quality of benevolence to Nirguna God? That's my question. You cannot actually. So if God is merciful, kind, benevolent, etc., you're not really speaking of a Nirguna God in the technical sense of the word. I personally therefore think that Rammohun's God, Brahman, is really a very judicious mix of the personal and the impersonal. Please also bear in mind, and Professor Killingley may not have really consulted the Brahmo Shangit here. There is at least one song in Rammohun's repertoire where he addresses Brahman as Tumi, thou, very personalized form. So it's not entirely as though Rammohun did not understand this problem himself, but I think he was constrained by certain things which he would not have crossed. Okay, I come to the last part, and can I have 5 or 7 minutes more?
Yes.
I think I should be able to finish. This third part is on the uniqueness and importance of Rammohun as a Vedanti. We cannot but acknowledge that. I mean, however critical I may be of Rammohun as a thinker, as in a Vedanti, I cannot but wish away the fact that he holds a position in the history of Indian thought and the history of Indian Vedanta, which cannot be denied. First of all, Ramon is the person who revives an interest in modern India, revives an interest in the spiritual and intellectual understanding of Vedanta as a school of discipline. I think Vedanta was practically not dead, but certainly unpopular in the 17th and 18th century. It wasn't unheard of, but judging by what happened after the early 19th century, you have to really admit that Vedanta bounces back with Ramon. Not only that, Ramon is also at the forefront of a movement which after him tries to read Vedanta as quintessential Indian thought. And you have a whole galaxy of great names in that. Vivekananda, and surprisingly Gandhi himself, Jordan's has produced a book on, the Advaitic thought in Gandhi's repertoire. And of course, Radhakrishna. And many others who I don't even know about. But Advaita somehow remains at the forefront of Indian thought ever since Ramon. There is the Bhakti revolution, of course. I mean, Vaishnavism comes back with the bang. There's ISKCON and there's everything else. But please remember, even this Vaishnavism is a form of Vedanta. It's Bhakti Vedanta. It's not the Nirguna Vedanta, but it's Bhakti Vedanta. You cannot escape Vedanta in some form or the other. The last person to comment on the Vedanta before Rammohun was a Vaishnava. And he wrote the Govinda Bhashya. Baldev Vidya Bhushan, I think his name was. He was an Oriya, based in Vrindavan. Okay. Third, Rammohun's uniqueness also lay in the fact that he was not prepared to acknowledge Vedanta as purely a moksha shastra. I think that explains Professor Killingley's very pertinent and repeated insistence on the fact that for Rammohun, sannyasi was not the typical person to go to. The Brahmanishta Grihastha, pious householder, was just as good. I think, I don't know if I want to hazard the guess that this thought came to him from Anglican Protestantism. That even the pious householder is as good as the renunciate in terms of God realization. I see a connection between Rammohun's position here of denying Vedanta purely as a moksha shastra and rather tilting towards the dharmic view, trying to read dharma at the center of things. And if that is so, then he is very visibly connected with Bunkin, who in the 1870s first experiments with positivism of Kant and then goes to the reformulation of dharma in reordering society. The point that I'm trying to argue here is that for Rammohun, upasana, the adoration of God, etc., doesn't just mean acknowledging the creator and the divinity of the world. It also means acknowledging God realization, consciousness about God as a meeting point between interpersonal relationships. It's a thing which will reorder society, reorder civil society. It's a meeting ground of interpersonal relationships. This is the unique part, I think, in Rammohun's thought. Rammohun to me is a kind of religious materialist, if you ask me. He is bold and courageous enough to say that the adoration of God not only brings bliss and beatitude, it also brings your desired goals in life. He very clearly says that it brings you dignity and honor. And isn't there that famous statement from him to Digby, which says, religion is fine so long as it brings political advantage and social comfort? I mean, how much more utilitarian can you get than that? And utilitarianism doesn't gel with Vedanta at all. Vedanta is transcendental. It can never be utilitarian, as Ramon tries to put it. And that is the uniqueness in Ramon of trying to project things in a very innovative way. You may or may not accept it, but that's his reading of Vedanta. As I said, he detects elements in Vedanta which can lend themselves to modernity. He doesn't really modernize Vedanta, as it were. Finally, I'll end this presentation for whatever it's worth by trying to very briefly compare the two famous Vedantins from 19th century Bengal, Ramon and Vivekananda. I think it's worth the effort. I really need to work on this, and I'm very keen to work on this, especially after I heard Professor Killingley. They need to be compared. But I can say at this stage, two things which struck me very forcefully. Number one, they're both cosmopolitan in their approach, and they contribute substantially to make Vedanta cosmopolitan. And if I read Professor Killingley correctly in his gist that he sent me, it is this cosmopolitanism that makes Rammohun modern. If that is so, I think Vivekananda has an edge over even Rammohun. He's more cosmopolitan, if you ask me, in a certain sense. The other thing which I found interesting is that there is a very subtle and significant difference in the English and Bengali writings of both. They don't quite say the same thing. Obviously, they were meant for different audiences. But more than that, they said subtly and significantly different things. It is worth researching into what they said in the English language commentaries on the Vedanta or translations and in the Bengali versions. I doubt if they said exactly the same thing. And again, as I said, this is not because the difference is not because they were addressed to different audiences. They were also bestowed with different agendas. I think I'll end there and await any comments or questions.
Thank you, Professor Sen. Thank you very, very much. I think we have had slightly contrasting points of view here, and I'm sure there will be some questions or clarifications at least to both the speakers. We don't have very much time, but there are time for a few questions. So anybody wants to start off?
I wish we had more people, by the way.
Yeah, I know.
Vedanta is quite unpopular, as I can see.
I'm sorry about that. Yes. So if I might provoke you, Professor Killingley, how would you like to respond to Professor Sen's point that Ramon actually is not in any way an Adhunika Vedanta?
Sorry, he's not in any way
A modern Vedanti.
not in any way a modern Vedanti.
Adhunik is the Bengali word.
Right, yeah. The question is could be understood in two ways. Is he not an Adhunik Vedanti because he's not sufficiently modern, or because he's not strictly Vedantic? I would say that he's not strictly Vedantic. I think it's true that his Vedanta, I wouldn't say it's a sub-commentary on Shankara. His Vedanta Grantha, his first Bengali book, is neither commentary on the Vedanta Sutras, independent of Shankara, nor a sub-commentary on Shankara. It's a text which selectively follows Shankara, but doesn't always follow Shankara, because Shankara, either Rammohun has failed to understand Shankara, which is quite possible, or he has disagreed with Shankara and suppresses what Shankara says. And certainly in the sutra I commented on just now, he completely ignores Shankara, and certainly doesn't follow Shankara's view that that only the sannyasi can reach freedom from rebirth. So Rammohun, I think, is taking Vedanta in a tactical sort of way, that he knows Vedanta is respected, he knows that Advaita Vedanta is respected, but he doesn't agree with everything Advaita Vedanta says, and he uses it as a way of addressing his Hindu readership. And to a certain extent, as a way of addressing his European readership as well, because he wants to show, as he says, that idolatry and polytheism are contrary to the Hindu authorities, and those authorities include Advaita Vedanta. But he doesn't address, I don't think he has sufficient training in the tradition to address Advaita Vedanta in its own terms consistently. But he uses it in his way. And I think the point that Rammohun's God isn't really nirguna because God is benevolent. This is one of the points where the discrepancy between Rammohun's Vedanta and, if you like, authentic Advaita Vedanta show that Rammohun has to a certain extent accepted the idea of a benevolent providence from European thought, and it was an idea that was already had its opponents in Rammohun's time. And he wrote as if this was the same Brahman that Shankara was thinking of, but of course it's not, because as Professor Amiya rightly pointed out, a nirguna god is not a benevolent god. Yeah. So there is a definite discrepancy between Rammohun's claim to be modern and Rammohun's claim to be Vedantic. Yeah.
Anybody else who would like to say something?
My name is Madhubika Majumdar. Am I being heard?
Yes, please. Yes,
we
please
can't see you. Turn on the
We
video.
can't see you.
Don't, because my net connection is not very good.
Okay, okay. Carry on, carry on, Malvika Majumdar. Yeah.
One or two points. You see, coming back to the Nirguna issue, you know, Shankar makes a very interesting clarification while answering this question, whether Brahman is at all knowable or unknowable. Right? If it's unknowable, then the whole thing is very futile to discuss about Brahman. Right? Because then it doesn't fall into what is called a pattern of logic. Now, Shankara basically agrees with this view, but carries on to say that the unknowability is there exactly the way we feel about ourselves, I, the Atman, which I know exists, but I have no clear opinion about it. So the whole process has to be a clarificatory process rather than, you know, referring to Brahman, whether he is in reality existing in Nirguna or Saguna form or this and that, right? So the internal clarification will help us to understand the cosmic understanding of Brahman. So that's the first point. Second point is Shankara's whole argument is therefore concentrating on clarification of Atman, not clarification of what Brahman is, to start with. You know, the whole concept of illusion is we have an understanding that our Atman is Karta, Bhokta, and Jnata, where at the same time it is none of these. Apply the same logic to the Brahman, you will find that the same thing follows from this basic argument, that we believe him to be the creator of this universe, but actually he is not at all the creator of this universe, right? The entire creation is superimposed on Brahman. So if we don't understand the logic of superimposition, then we have not understood the, you know, the basics of Advaita Vedanta. And that is where I think the fault lies with Rammohun. He saw it from the Christian point of view, from Western point of view, and not from the Indian point of view. That's my first point. I mean, I can go on with few more, but I can stop here too.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else with any other comments?
I had a small comment to make in the context of Professor Killingley's talk. I think if I remember correctly, he says that Rammohun's objection to Hindu polytheism sprang from the fact that there was also in it anthropomorphism, that they were building God in man's image. I think it was more than that. If you look carefully, Rammohun is also completely aghast at what he calls the immoral qualities of Hindu gods. I mean, for Krishna, for example, he has very vitriolically charged words. I mean, he says at one place, Krishna was accused of stealing things which even my servant will not do. Those are his words, actually. So therefore, there is also the moral dimension to what his objections are, not just anthropomorphism.
So I think we are just on dot on our allotted time span. So I will take this opportunity to thank the two professors, Killingley and Sen, and the handful of enthusiasts who joined today's evening's discussion. But we will be back next month with another talk on Rammohun. And I hope Professor Sen and Killingley will attend that too, because we can be further enlightened on Rammohun by both of you.
I've been attending all of your talks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
So thank you everybody for joining. So we will, as Professor Mukherjee said, we'll be back with next lecture in August. Till then, stay well, stay safe. Thank you. Good night, good evening, good afternoon.